welcome to everyone who is joining us at the moment with this presentation, How to Attract the Perfect Customer, as part of the Swindon and Wiltshire Local Enterprise Partnership Annual Conference. So I'll hand over to Daniel, who'll be taking you through this very interesting subject. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. I'll be moderating that and keeping an eye on it. Just so you know, my name is Rob Creer. I am the Assistant Growth Hub Manager. If you've got any questions or queries, just drop them in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody. Hi, my name's Daniel Plowright from Inquire. So I'm going to spend the next kind of 20-25 minutes just running through some thoughts around how to attract your perfect or ideal customer. And then, as Rob said, if there's any questions or if it prompts any thoughts for discussion, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for a conversation. I'm going to use the dreaded PowerPoint for this, but it might hopefully this isn't rocket science, but maybe it might just give you a few things to have a think about that says, we used to do this, but now we've forgotten to do it. Or actually, that's quite a good idea. Maybe we should go and have a look at it. So I'm not trying to give you a whole list of things to do, but maybe it might help with your kind of sales and marketing direction a little bit by taking some of this stuff on board. I think the first thing for my mind is, if we're all chasing an ideal or perfect customer, how do we actually define what they are? Because it's going to be clearly very different for everybody in terms of, the types of product or service that you provide. And ultimately, we could Google it and we could get a definition, and we might see something like this, which doesn't seem unreasonable. They understand you, they're able to pay, is always quite important. Pay on time, don't need chasing. But also, if you've got a scaled product or kind of bronze, silver and gold options within your portfolio, that they're able to pay based on service level and understand that. They're easy to attract and communicate with. I think a key one for a lot of us, certainly in the service side of things, is there's the ability for them to pay on a repeat basis. Now that might be a kind of classic recurring subscription type approach, or it might be just that they're a repeat customer. I think the other important one here is about generating referrals. So you start to look at that in a little bit more detail. You might end up with a kind of checklist that looks something like this, which is, okay, if I look at my own customer base at the moment, kind of where would I sit if I've got 10 out of 10, they're absolutely wonderful, ideal. How many of my customers actually sit in that bucket or that group, and how many are causing me problems in terms of how much time and effort they're taking to service? So I think you've got to look back at your current client base to establish who you do really want to be having a conversation with, because ultimately, do you want more of the same? Do you have ideal customers at the moment? Are you having the right kind of relationships with these people? Or is it time to say, look, actually, now I've built my business to the point that it's at, actually the type of people I'm working with, the type of customers and clients I've got at the moment are not really where I want to be. And that's okay. It's just a question of how you kind of then transition away from that going forward. And I think the key thing for us, we do a lot of kind of client engagement, customer interviewing, kind of trying to understand how the relationship between the supplier, let's call it, and the customer is going. And often there's a real mismatch between what the supplier thinks they're selling and what the customer is actually buying. And the messaging is all over the place. So the customer is coming to you the prospect is coming to you to solve a problem, potentially, in most cases, either an extreme problem or not so extreme problem. And you're offering a solution. They're perceiving that you're giving them the best possible solution. So I think there you've got to say, is my messaging correct? And if I haven't got the right pool of customers, is there something wrong with who I'm attracting? Because you'd have done all of this stuff in terms of trying to identify the need and all the usual bits and pieces from your sales and marketing activity. You'd have gone through this whole process of bringing them on board and nurturing them. And I think, again, where we talk to businesses say that I'm just not happy with my client base because, as I say, they cost too much to service or whatever it might be. It's often that they're just attracting the wrong people. And because they're a prospect, people engage and you end up doing business with them in many cases. It's only on reflection often you go, actually, my time and effort may have been better spent doing something else. It's also a question of kind of what type of relationship you really want to have with these people. Because, again, I suppose I'm just saying, in terms of how you break down what you do, you don't necessarily want to service everybody in the same way. Kind of how have you segmented that, which we'll touch on again in a few minutes. But it's just trying to understand, who do you really, really want to talk to? Who is the optimum, and how have you kind of painted a picture around what they might look like? And what we're saying here is there's potentially some evidence and some strings you can pull in terms of identifying who that might be. The other key question for us is that often we talk to businesses and they say, yeah, we've got great customer relationships. So yeah, we want more of the same. And I suppose a lot of what we do is just put a little bit of a test on that, a little bit of a stress test, if you like, in terms of how strong that relationship really is. Because obviously a lot of, many businesses say, well, I've got customer feedback through whichever source it might be. I'm getting customer feedback coming back in, which is telling me that I'm doing a good job. So why should I change anything? And if I did, therefore, want more of the same, then that should be a fairly easy process to follow. I think the key thing here is that depending on, or regardless really of how you're getting your feedback into your business, and if you're not, you really should be. So that'd be one thing that's worth making a note of it. What you've got to be really conscious of is what they call confirmation bias, is that ultimately all of us kind of focus on the bit that confirms what we want to hear. And often we tend to ignore maybe the slightly negative bit. And so I think when you're looking at things like customer feedback, you've got to look at it in the round and say, look, actually, is this a representative sample or representative of what my customer base is really thinking and saying? We're going to kind of dive into that in a little bit more detail. Other key consideration here in terms of how to keep hold of customers, because once you've got a customer is, well, ultimately you want the longest possible relationship. If they're a good customer, they pay on time, they're good margin, you want to keep hold of them for as long as it's reasonably possible. So let's just take a moment looking at why these relationships break down. And the vast majority of reasons that the supplier customer relationships break down is because the customer feels the supplier doesn't care. However that's come about, they feel that actually I'm going to get a better response and a different response somewhere else. It's kind of captured under this term of indifference. The next biggest chunk on here, so we're now talking about 80% of the reasons why these relationships break down are completely within the control, specifically of the supplier, because it's customer thinks we don't care, or the customer's flagged an issue and we haven't resolved it to their satisfaction. There's always two sides to the story, and we know that some customers can be harder work than others. But ultimately, it's not price. Often, if you've got a sales team in place, the reason that we lost a customer or they didn't onboard for a new product is, well, we were too expensive. It's a reason, but I think ultimately it's an excuse, to be honest, in many cases, because price would be the next largest one. There's a big chunk here that people can do things about. You then kind of start to explore why customers don't buy more stuff. Why don't they buy more of what you actually have on offer? And these are the kind of capturing the key headlines of the reasons why. Ultimately, it comes down to managing expectations. And we've seen that over the last month, what is now 18, 24 months, with COVID impacting, supply chain, etc. Customers just want to know and be kind of truthful about where things are in the supply chain. And typically your order cycle may have been normally 48 hours, but it may now be 2 weeks. So you just got to manage those expectations. But there's a whole raft of reasons which are quite common, regardless of industry, regardless of product or service, that customers will cite as to why they're not just engaging and buying more, whatever it might be. And I think you need to take that into account. I think the other thing that businesses hide behind is we don't get any complaints, and the stats bear out that for every complaint that comes in, and whether it's a strong an irritation or a complaint, however you flag it, there's a big number that don't get raised, using the classic iceberg analogy. Now clearly, larger organizations will have complaints running into the hundreds and thousands, and therefore they've got a big data set. So on a smaller business, you're not going to see this kind of number. But the issue here is it's a lot easier for me to take my irritation out on social media than it is to spend an hour on the phone trying to deal with something that's mildly irritating. So I think just be careful and be mindful if you're in a business where you have a way for clients to give feedback and you're not seeing issues being flagged, because none of us are perfect. You would expect some sort of underlying level of issues to be flagged back. And whether they're major issues, there might be just suggestions for improvement, is something that you can take on board. I think the backdrop again to this is that ultimately, and it's worth reinforcing, and it depends which industry you're in, is the cost of acquisition versus the cost of retention. It just costs a lot more to onboard and service a new customer rather than one that you've already got. If we then look at measuring customer satisfaction, so again we've touched on the fact that I've managed to keep I've managed to bring somebody on board. They're a fee-paying customer. They could be on a scale of perfect or not. I'm now going to assess kind of where they sit within that. I've got feedback coming in. My feedback says I'm doing a good job. Well, does it really? Because typically, again, using this analogy of the iceberg, what you can actually see when people respond to feedback is typically either ends of this spectrum. If you do email surveys, the average response rate is around about 30%. And the 30% that respond are at either ends of this bell curve. So effectively, you've got the top end, those that love what you do are responding. The bottom end, those that aren't so happy are responding. You're aggregating that to an average performance and saying, we're doing okay. We haven't got a clue what the people in the middle think. And that group is called the silent majority. So it's understanding kind of what they might be saying to you as a business and trying to find out how you might engage with that. And there's a good example here, which is just walking you through an example of a conversation that might happen between, when we're conducting a client satisfaction interview in terms of what the client might be saying. So here is an example of us having a dialogue with the client of an accountancy practice. Client thinks that, if you just read this on Facebook, basically the client is saying, I think they've done a good job and they've helped me out and I think that's great and I would recommend them. So unprompted, they've said that they would recommend. So is this a perfect client? Is it not a perfect client? Well, that's a judgment call based on what size they are. Do they fit? Are they an ideal fit for what this accountancy practice is trying to achieve? Are they high maintenance? Are they not high maintenance? Are they making the right margins? Are they, are the expectations correct? It's all that kind of stuff that comes into play. But on face value, this looks like it's a strong relationship and they're recommending. I think just picking up on the recommend, unprompted, you haven't even had to ask. You said, I actively recommend this business. Fantastic. Just step out of that. These stats are borne out every time we do a survey. We will go back to a business and say, on average, somewhere between 70, 80, 90% of the clients we've spoken to are saying they would recommend you. What process do you have in place to follow that through? Inevitably, the businesses don't, not in all cases, but inevitably the businesses don't have a process in place to follow that up because they're too busy doing what I might call random marketing activity to people they don't know yet, where the messaging's slightly off. Yet we've got a whole pool of people that may be enough for this year's sales figures that you could probably engage with if only you asked. And then you get into the whole reasons why businesses don't ask for referrals, and that's a whole separate conversation. But there's a massive opportunity there, typically in many businesses. And this comes back to this whole point, which is if you want people to make introductions into your service or product, they need to be really clear about what you do. So unless you've elaborated on that and made your messaging really clear and painted the picture of what that perfect relationship or ideal relationship looks like, then they're going to struggle to make those introductions in the first place. So again, it's thinking about your messaging, and typically the first port of call of that is going to be on the website. Even if it's a personal recommendation, I think it'd be fair to say that most people will go, do you know what, I'm just going to check these guys out. I'm going to go and check these guys out, and the easiest way to check somebody out is on their website. Okay, well, while I'm on the web, I might as well just check out somebody else who does something similar. And am I going to be tempted to go down that particular route, which is something I'll touch on in a second. So I think, again, there's opportunities here in terms of, how you kind of connect, how your messaging works. Are you asking for referrals? Are you then following up on those opportunities? Because that's where, if you've got an ideal customer already in your hand, they're going to know people that are like them. It should be fairly straightforward. We then ask some scoring questions, and again, businesses get caught out with scoring because they kind of take, human nature is we typically take an average position, and ultimately you end up in the situation says, do you think I'm doing okay here? Well, okay, you need to be looking at these metrics on a regular basis, and you might have a 10-point scale, you might be using Net Promoter Score, but ultimately what you've got here is that it's really on a 5-point scale, you need to be scoring 4s and 5s. Because 3, although it's average, is not good enough. And there's a whole host of data that supports why that might be. But ultimately, customers who score you 5 out of 5 or 9 or 10 out of 10 are going to stick around and are going to recommend. That's fairly obvious, or should be fairly obvious in most cases. But if their score just drops down by 1 point or a couple of points on a 10-point scale, those percentages drop off dramatically. And this is where business goes, I'm doing all right. I'm scoring a 3 out of 5, a 4 out of 5. I'm doing okay. Well, and then they get surprised when some of these relationships break down. So if you've got perfect customers going out the door, going somewhere else, then that's ultimately going to be a bit of a problem. I think ultimately the last thing that we would kind of touch on is we've got a customer here who thinks they're great. We've got a customer here who's saying, yes, I'd recommend. They've given them some scores which look okay, could be a bit better in some cases. And then we ask what else could they improve on? And ultimately what comes out of that is often a conversation around, well, they do this for me, but it'd be great if they also did whatever this thing is. Often the supplier will say, well, we do that. Yeah, but your messaging's not getting through. So the customer's now got a problem they're trying to solve. You actually could solve it for them, but they don't realize it. So it's again, yeah, how many touch points are there? And in this example, we've got this same customer saying, actually, I've got a bit of a challenge because of the points that I'm flagging up. And I think there should be a level of engagement here. It's then a question of how that supplier, if you like, in this particular case, chooses to respond. Because they could take it on the chin, draw a line and have a conversation. It's not about dropping the price. This is about resetting expectations in terms of value. But a lot of businesses seeing something like this get their back up and go, yeah, kind of how dare they say that? Yeah, we've overserviced this client. We've really looked after them well, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, fine, whatever. But ultimately, this client's perception is the reality of the situation. And that's what they think at the moment. So the key thing here for this business would be, they should be on an annual renewal for their annual year-end accounts or whatever. How likely is it that they're going to stay? If I looked at the first part of that conversation, very likely. If I looked at the last part of this conversation, maybe not 100%. So there needs to be a conversation that's put in play. And I think the other thing here is a lot of business is another easy win. Referrals is an easy win. This is another easy win, is about closing the feedback loop, because lots of businesses ask for feedback and don't do anything with it. They don't go back, they don't even brief it internally, let alone go back to the customer. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do there. I think the other thing here is, we have to look at the numbers. This isn't just a kind of, pie in the sky discussion around marketing. It's like, we're doing this for a reason. We're doing this to hit some numbers. So unless we've got a sales forecast or a target or whatever it might be, well, where are we heading? So yeah, in this simplistic example, here's a business, it's got some sales revenue with a bit of seasonality. Okay, fair enough. We would expect the business to have an underlying level of sale because maybe it's got some recurring or repeat business, and we would expect it to have an understanding at that baseline of what it's likely to achieve without much additional activity over the top. So now it knows it needs to find this, whatever this 30 is, 30,300 pounds, 30 quid, doesn't really matter, but it's a ratio. There's a number it needs to find through its various initiatives. So then they dive in and go, well, my marketing activity needs to find that gap. Well, does it really? Because if you look at where I'm starting from, the key question here is really, how secure is that revenue to start with? Going back to our scoring, going back to our customer base, is that safe? Because using this analysis, or analogy, which we've all probably seen, I think everything's great because the supplier has asked the client says it's great. But what the client's really thinking is, I'm not coming back. And it's having this kind of test point with your customers where you probably feel there's a good relationship in place. And in most cases, there probably is. But there'll be some really quite important customers where it's not, maybe there's some underlying concerns that you're not aware of. So again, you need to pick up on that. And I think it's, again, businesses fall into the trap of assuming that customers are going to be there for a long time. And so it's again having a look at how often should they be buying? Are they buying on that frequency, and how much money are they spending? And this example here of a stationery supplier who told us that I've got 850 customers. Some basic analysis in about 5 minutes established that they got 250 customers, which is a huge difference to everything they're looking to do, whether it's business exit, business planning, forecasting, marketing, cash flow, the whole lot. And a lot of business, this is a kind of grown-up business, decent sized business, did not have a handle on this kind of key performance indicator. So it's something you need to have a look at. I think the other thing that we tend to forget about is what the actual real value of these customers is. What is the value of your perfect customer? Is it that transaction, that one-off transaction? Is it actually their lifetime value? And we tend to forget about lifetime value, because if I spend 20 quid every 6 weeks just to keep the numbers low, and this example we were using was somebody at a hairdresser's. Am I worth 20 quid a pop, or am I actually worth more like £1,500 over my lifetime? So am I, what level of engagement do you want with me? And in your own business, you can work these numbers out for yourself in terms of what they should be saying. So if you go back through this, it's like, it'll come down, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do to push it back up. So it's again, looking at those opportunities and saying, before I dive off and do some blind marketing with some often not well-targeted messaging, do I really understand the problems I'm solving for my customer base such that I can decide where I choose to spend my time and effort? Because I've got past customers I could re-engage with. I've got current customers I should be doing something with. I've got referrals I should definitely be doing something with. And then whatever time I've got left at the end, potentially, is where my lead generation is. And all we're trying to say here is really, where should you spend your time and effort? So from that point of view, you've got gap analysis that you should be looking at as well in terms of, how often, have you actually done the simple exercise of saying, I've got some products and services, depending on your market, I've got some customers. Simple grid. Who buys what, ultimately? Where is it not appropriate to sell them something? And I've got an opportunity that starts to come through, which ultimately says, there's my low-hanging fruit, dead easy. I've got those green dots on there that said those are the ones I should be chasing. I'm not going to sell any more of product number 4 because it's low margin. I'm not going to sell anything else to customer number 6 because they're a pain. But that starts to open up a whole load of other opportunities. And gap analysis businesses just don't do regularly enough. Last bit, customer segmentation. If I was running a pet shop, just to keep a simpler example, who am I actually selling to? Oh, clearly, okay, fair enough. The dog can't come in and get its wallet out, but ultimately I'm selling to that pet owner. I've got a massive segmentation of customers that I'm dealing with ultimately. And do we actually go down to this niche level? Because even at this, you're going to take it down another level again, and you can go down another level again. And it's a question of identifying where your niche market is, so you can get the targeting right and understand it. Did some work recently with somebody that works on dog shows, and you wouldn't believe how niche it gets. So just start to think about how that might play out in your own operation. And I think recognizing what's important to your customers through the whole area of social proof, all this kind of stuff that should be on your website and in your marketing material, which should be connecting with the right type of client or prospect. But unless you know what that ideal person looks like, how are you going to make sure that all this messaging is correct? So just to summarize on that, I know I've covered an awful lot, which was the aim of the exercise in 25 minutes, was, I would say, in terms of attracting the perfect customer, be clear on who you're actually trying to target. Only you can define that. Communicate to them effectively, nurture and maintain that relationship, create an opportunity for them to give you feedback, however you do that, and make sure you review and refine your messaging. And that's the opportunity for you. There's a link here to a very simple calculator where you can say, look, actually, this is worth having a look at. Just put your numbers in and you can play around with that calculator. So there we go. I will open up, Rob, if there's any questions that have come in.